Hey there, hunters, and again, I welcome thee to the Gunners Guild, where I swear I'll make Monster Hunter content again at some point. But for now, we're still playing Remnant 2, trying to showcase all the builds I have saved in my 8 little loadout slots. But before we get into this video, I do want to review some of the other builds I recently covered, in case you haven't caught those and you're looking for build ideas. So far, we have covered the Hugs build, which is performing just fine, though I do recommend Plasma Cutter now that I've played with it some more, but I still like bows. We also did Shotgun Swapper, which is kind of a weird mod ranged build at this point that I wish I liked more than I actually do. I really love Swapper builds, but this one just doesn't feel right to me. Then we went over to the Storm and Night build on the Sandstorm and Thunderstorm setup, and that's a fun one. It performs extremely well for a meme build. And then we did the Spearlock mod spam build, which is one of the only mod-based builds that feels really good to me right now, since the mod gen nerf kind of hit everything pretty hard. And following that up, we did Glad Chad, our melee gladiator tank build, which can reasonably demolish every boss it can reach. Melee is extremely strong right now. And lastly, we did the Havoc builds, which are probably the best builds in the game for the ease of use and crazy output, though I do fully expect these to be nerfed, so don't get attached to those. There are still a few more builds I want to talk about that I personally like. Today we're going to go over the Sac Summoner build that was enabled by Invoker. It's actually a summoner based build that works, which is crazy, summoner being used for something besides the explosive mods and stuff, right? And as an extra small bonus, I did want to talk about a movement speed build that I use to run through adventures to collect corpse drops and race the bosses. And it's really easy to swap to a move build to just get through zones. But anyway, sorry for the preamble, let's just get into this. Alright, so Sac Summoner. This is an odd build that I originally made during the Beyond Hell mod, and I was excited to be able to recreate it here in the official DLC 2 patch. The basis of the build is to use Summoner's Sacrifice ability to use the explosive damage as a primary source of your actual damage, and thus use Summoner itself as the primary source of damage, which is not something it's really known for. As a brief review of the Summoner archetype, I want to mention that it does have two flaws that have prevented it from being useful outside of its damage perk specifically. The first is that summons don't deal a lot of damage, and they die fast on Apocalypse. So using active summons to deal damage just doesn't really work because they hit like wet noodles, since there really isn't many sources of skill crit or anything besides just additive damage for them, which I get because if they were strong they could just be used to carry players through the entire game with no effort. Look, I get it, but they should still be better or just scale a lot harder on Apocalypse somehow. The second thing about Summoner is that you can't use them as defensive units either because they can't actually pull aggro from bosses, and even if they did, they'd probably just die really quick. So really, with Summoner, we only have one option to actually use kind of right now, and that is Sacrifice. And I feel like this is all known and a waste of time to talk about, but I wanted to voice this anyways. So, Sacrifice. This got buffed in the recent patch to allow summons to deal additional damage when they're at fuller life rather than lower life. However, in the patch notes it is stated that this is a part of the Prime perk, but I actually think it's just the Sacrifice in general, as with and without the Prime perk, the summons explodes for about the same damage. So thankfully it seems like Sacrifice just got better across the board, and we don't have to use Summoner as our prime. And if you've used Sacrifice in the past, you know that they actually don't deal a whole lot of damage to begin with, except for the Reaver if you can actually hit with all the cluster bombs it drops, which is what we're going to be using. But also, Reaver has such a long cooldown that you can only use it every once or twice and have to wait a long time, so it never really worked before. And that's kind of where Invoker comes in, and it enables this build and pretty much every skill build. Since we don't need to be Summoner Prime, we can use Invoker Prime Visionary to get the additional skill charge, and whenever we use a skill, we're instantly going to refund 10% of a skill's cooldown. With this, we can actually sustain consistent summons and a sacrifice loop for our Reaver, and thus finally attempt to make use of a Summoner as a primary source of our damage. We're going to be using Way of Kaula as our skill here because it does have some front-loaded damage, but also Lydusa is a good choice because Brittle is pretty strong. Anyway, to achieve this loop, we're going to need a few specific trinkets to get this build rolling. First thing is that because this build is a skill spam build and skill animations can't be interrupted, we need to be fast so we don't get animation locked and die. So we do need increased cast speed. Now, while you can get the 125% increased cast speed with Gesture Spell, Relic Fragment, Kinetic Cycle Stone, and the Flashcaster trait, you actually don't need all of it that high. When you're increasing your cast speed, yes, it does make your animation faster, but it doesn't actually make summoning any faster, so you can get out of the animation quicker and avoid harm, but the Reaver is going to pop up at the same time regardless. So your Sacrifice is going to be at the same time, and thus cast speed doesn't actually increase your DPS, just your safety. That being said, we do want cast speed because of that safety. but also because we actually don't have a ton of good options to scale our damage anyway, since minion sacrifice is very specific damage, being just skill and explosive. So roundabout way of getting to the trinkets, but for the amulet we're going to be using Jester's Bell. This is effectively 15% all damage all the time for us, and it gives us our cast speed. While we can use Detonation Trigger for a little bit more damage, and even the Silver Ribbon for haste, you kind of want the cast speed for that safety net, but it's not required. For the rings, the main thing here is that we're going to be using the new Soul Feast ring, and that reduces skill cooldowns by 8% whenever a minion dies. So whenever we sacrifice a minion, we're going to get 50% of the cooldown back from the sacrifice itself, 20% cooldown from the Evoker Prime, since both summoning and sacrificing counts as skill use, and 8% from the Soul Feast ring, so almost 80% refund instantly. For the other rings, you're going to have two sets of options. You can either do a set of cooldown reduction items, which will make it a little bit easier to sustain the sacrifice loop, though only barely, as most of our cooldown is percentage based. So if we have like 120 second cooldown and we refund 80% of it, we're going to have 24 seconds left to recover. But if we have a 60 second cooldown, then we're only going to have 12 seconds to recover. So you can either go the route that reduces cooldowns, or you can go the route that increases your damage. They're going to end up about the same. For the first setup of rings, it's going to be Burden of the Rebel and Black Pawn Stamp for 25% skill cooldown. And then the last slot I have Burden of the Gambler, since we're not really hitting weak spots anyway. You can also use the last slot for Kinetic Cycle Stone if you want more cast speed as well. For the damage setup, you can just run no cast speed or cooldown items and just go strictly for crit stacking, which is going to help your cluster bombs. The sacrifice is technically a player skill, so the bombs Reaver's drop do scale off player crit, despite minions themselves not scaling off player crit. So you can go and run the crit stacking setup for the bomb damage, and this is your typical setup with Token of Favor, Braided Thorns, and Burden of the Gambler. For the relic, we're going to be using Profane Heart, which is the new favorite relic, gotta love that leech. And for the fragments, we have skill damage, skill cooldown, and cast speed. There's really not much else you can use here to bolster your damage, but honestly, you can drop any of these fragments and just go with damage reduction, health, and armor, just to get more bulk and make this whole style easier. And you're not going to be losing too much anyway. For our traits, of course we're going bulky. We want Flashcaster, since that's a big chunk of our cast speed pretty much for free. Amplitude, because AoE is important so we get those cluster bombs to hit. And we absolutely want Chakra for our mod duration. And then we have the bulk, Vigor, Siphoner, and Fortify. I'm running Expertise and Spirit as my last two traits, but these aren't necessarily mandatory, and you can invest in more bulk like Strong Back and Bark Skin if you want. Our weapons are going to be the go-to for being Monolith and Nebula. These two guns are just the best pair for any build that's not relying on gun or mod damage. And if you don't know by now, it's just hard to pass them up. They have good tracking, they have AoE, they're additive damage, they actually do some good damage, and they're just fire and forget mods. They're just too useful. And so by now, you've seen plenty of the boss kills and how this setup kind of works. It's absolutely not for everybody. It's really hard to see what's going on, and you should have a good idea of boss patterns before you actually give this a try, because you're going to be in animation lock for a lot of the time, just constantly summoning and sacrificing, so you're going to have to be familiar when it's safe to do that. But also, this build's not immortal. It's tanky. You can take a hit from any boss on Apocalypse for sure, but you're not tanking 2 right away. So you have to be careful, and honestly, that's what kind of makes it fun for me. It's good, but a little risky. Not being able to see and not being able to just, face tank everything and not die makes it a pretty risky scenario. And so basically the whole playstyle of this is that we're going to summon a Reaver to sacrifice, and then we're going to use Way of Kayula to, generate some more skill cooldown and some damage. And then we're going to put on our 2 mods, and then go back to the summoner, sack it, summon it again, sack it, back to Kayula for skill cooldown. Use Sandstorm whenever it's available, because that Spell Weaver is going to help increase our skill cooldowns. And then just kind of cycle all these things, and it's a lot of little pieces to juggle. And so while I would recommend this build because it feels unique to play, I just know a lot of people aren't going to enjoy this, as there are easier builds that perform better. But this is the first summoner build that actually utilizes summons as the main damage dealer, and not just using the summon for the perks. So I'm having fun with it, and I'm glad to see Summoner get some good use. I do want to see a full permanent minion build viable in the future, but for now, I'll settle for Sacrifice, because Sacrifice Summoner is another favorite archetype of mine for RPG games. So anyway, that's the Summoner build. Sorry for all the derailing there, but thanks for sticking with it. But now I'm going to talk about another useful build for people, especially console players. Now, I get asked a lot, how do you farm corpse drop RNG items, such as the new trinkets or even aberrations? And while I thought it was pretty obvious, I guess it's not. So since we have loadouts, you always want to put a speed build, like just down at the bottom, have it saved. Having a build that you can run through zones fast is very useful for collecting trait books for XP and the new items whenever a DLC drops. You can also use these builds to speed to bosses if you want to just, do boss rush and get clips, and race through zones to trigger aberration spawns if you need some corrupted shards. So I do always have a speed build on hand, and I do recommend most other players do as well. It just makes life easier, especially if you're trying for those new corpse drop trinkets. So for this speed build, we hit the new speed cap of 200% movement speed. I mean, barely. We're not quite there, a couple percent off, but anyway, we're going to be starting with the archetypes. First is going to be the Alchemist as our prime. This way we can get Frenzy Dust for 20% movement speed for, 21 plus seconds. And then we can also use a lot of concoctions. Two of these concoctions being movement speed based, so we can get 16% movement speed out of just our concoctions. And with Frenzy Dust, we're sitting on 36% just from the Alchemist, which ain't too bad. Next, we're going to run Explorer for the Treasure Sense skill. This way we can sprint through areas and not miss the trinkets and trait books. While you can get more movement speed if you want to run like Planeswalker or the Handler Archetype, we really want Treasure Sense. Treasure Sense is a very underrated skill. You're going to save yourself a lot of time just not missing trinkets and not having, backtrack and, search a zone so thoroughly. Now for the necklaces, you're going to want to run the Participation Trophy or Weightless Weight. I prefer Weightless Weight, which gives you more movement speed based upon how much weight you have. If you put this on with Letos and the Meteor Shard Band Ring, which adds 50 weight, you can reach 140 total encumbrance, which will net you 21% increased movement speed with the Weightless Weight attached. Then we're going to want Ring of the Forest for 10% movement speed and Momentum Driver for 15% movement speed, and that also gives us stagger resistance while we run, which is nice. The last slot, up to you. I like the Continuance Ring for skill duration so I get more time on Frenzy Dust and Treasure Sense, but you can go with Deceiver to get more movement speed or what else really, like just pick something. Both these trinkets were at 82% increased movement speed. Then you pair this up with your Swiftness trait, which is going to hit you 97%, which is just about cap without going over. So we're basically about as fast as you can go, and trust me, you're zooming. While the weapons don't matter here, since we're just blitzing through the world, we're going to be using Monolith and Nebula since they can seek out enemies on their own and kind of take care of trash without a second thought. You just fire them and keep running, they'll kill behind you just fine. Though of course you are free to use whatever you like. For your relic and traits, they don't matter too much. I'd recommend at least getting, in the increased mod and skill durations, but other than that, I'd say invest in bulk and stamina so you can take hits as you run by and have plenty of stamina to get through enemies without stopping. Don't forget your concoctions, but otherwise, you're pretty much set. Save the sprinter build if you don't have one yet. You'll realize how useful it is just to have it on deck. But anyway, that's going to be all for me today. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Feel free to join my Discord in the description below. But yeah, peace and good luck out there, hunters.